Hisco, and on behalf of Brunel Library, I want to welcome you to our snapshot event for Poem City, Vermont School Funding, Equity, and Affordability with Executive Director of Public Assets, Stephanie Yu. Snapshot is a Vermont Humanities weekly program that hosts a variety of speakers at public libraries that foster resilient communities through engaging conversations. We want to extend our thanks to our partners at Vermont Humanities. Department of Libraries and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the Alma Gibbs Domptian Foundation. And thank you to Media Factory for sponsoring this live stream. Tonight we come together from across the state to listen, to learn, and to be inspired in community. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items. If you need restrooms, just head to the main desk and there you can get keys and they'll direct you to the open rooms. We have an ongoing seed swap that just got kicked off because despite the weather, spring is here. So if you're interested to browse seeds there, we're also having a plant and seed swap on May 3rd, and then a fabric swap on May 10th. So we're really trying to share resources here. The next snapshot event, Phantom Border, a personal recognizance of contemporary Germany with Vermont author Kirsten Lang, will be hosted by the Burnham Memorial Library at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, April 23rd. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker. Stephanie Yu has been with Public Assets since 2015 and became Executive Director in 2023. She is glad to be back to her New England roots after stints in the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and the West Coast. At Public Assets, she works on making Vermont's unique education funding system, the state budget, and family economic policies more equitable and responsive to the needs of Vermonters. Her fiscal experience in the public and private sectors in multiple states informs that work and includes staff time in the AmeriCorps programs, state budget offices, and state legislatures. Please join me in welcoming Steph.
All right. Am I good? Okay. Whoa. Okay.
Sounds good.
It sounds like it's on.
All right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all for having me, and thank you for coming and to participate in this. You're going to have to bear with me because I know this display with the monitors is always tricky, so just bear with me here. So again, I'm Stephanie Yu, the Executive Director of the Public Assets Institute. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we are a Montpelier-based nonpartisan nonprofit organization. And we work to improve the well-being of Vermonters through state fiscal and tax policy. And we've been working on education funding in Vermont for over 20 years because public education is the biggest and one of the most important things that the state does, and it's the most visible tax that Vermonters pay. It's also the only, see if this is gonna work for me, maybe not. It's also the only public service that's mentioned in the state constitution, and we spend half of our state resources on this. So this is the state budget, and this includes federal funds, but about half of our state resources are spent on public education. So as I kind of work through this talk, I'd like you to keep two questions in mind as I'm talking. First, what do you think the relationship is between public education and democracy? And is there a relationship, this is sort of a two-part question, so I'm kind of sneaking extra ones in there. But is there a relationship between the funding of public education and democratic participation in deciding school budgets? The second question I'd ask you to keep in mind as I'm talking is, what would it look like if all Vermont kids had the resources they needed to succeed? And how many of those resources, or which of those resources, should come through the public school system? So those are sort of the thought questions as we go here, and then I'll kind of leap into more of the information about the education funding structure. My goal is to really kind of give you the history of how we got the education funding system we have now, what's good about it, what's maybe lacking about it, or how we could improve it, and then talk a little bit about, I don't know how many of you are here because there's sort of a pretty active conversation happening about how to change public education in Vermont. Happening in Montpelier and probably happening in your communities. And so I want to kind of give the contours of that debate, sort of where we see the big decision points where Vermonters should, can and get involved and kind of weighing in on that conversation, and just make sure that you feel like you have a sense of what's going on there. So, a little bit of history, how the system works now, and then kind of the scope of what the changes that are being considered are in Montpelier. And I think there's going to be time for questions at the end. If there's anything that's sort of really confounding as I'm talking, please, I'm fine with interruptions if that works for you, if we want to clarify as we go here. But in case you haven't noticed, Vermont has a pretty unique education funding structure. And I think that's sort of a blessing and a curse, like lots of things, right? We do have one of the most equitable systems in the country, and that's not just our opinion, but I think that's a pretty widely shared opinion across the country among education experts. Because the wealth of the town in Vermont doesn't determine how much a town has to spend on its schools. Where the child lives matters much less here than it does in a lot of states. We've really succeeded in reducing the disparities between rich and poor communities, where many other states are still really struggling with that. But the uniqueness also means that it can be hard for people to understand the system, especially when what they decide on their school budget on town meeting day doesn't necessarily match what happens to their tax bill come August or November or whenever you get it. And there's been persistent inequities in the system before we had this system, while we have this system, that we haven't quite figured out how to solve. And I think there are some more growing pockets of inequities that we're going to talk about some tonight that hit some taxpayers and some districts harder than others, meaning that I think there's a lot of room for improvement in the public education system generally, and specifically in the finance side of that system. So I want to start with some history. Maybe people heard the conversation pre the beginning here, talking about some of the long-term history of the system. But just to set it up, so the old system that we had, and that a lot of states still have, and this was prior to 1997, was basically there was a local property tax to fund schools, and then there was what was called foundation aid from the state. And what that is the state established a basic tax rate that everybody paid in the state, and if you could raise, and then they set a foundation amount that every town, that they considered sort of an adequate amount of spending per pupil to get. And if you raise that amount through that tax rate, great, no problem. If you couldn't raise that much through that basic tax rate, then the state would chip in to get you up to that adequate level. And that's how a lot of states still do it. So it's a local tax rate, but the state might chip in if you can't raise enough for your town. But it really focuses on an adequacy level. Like, what's the bare minimum schools need, right? More than how does every school get what they need. And what happened in that system is that if a town wanted to spend more, they were pretty much on their own. So above that foundation amount, it was kind of a free-for-all, which meant you'd have much higher taxes, but not necessarily a lot more to spend per pupil. And so the way that it worked in practice is that it essentially served as a floor for rich towns and as a ceiling for poor towns, right? That would be all the poor towns would get, but then richer towns could spend whatever they wanted above that foundation amount. And so it led to these really stark disparities between rich towns and poor towns that a lot of states still have. And then the history of how that changed is that there was a lawsuit brought in the mid-90s by the Brigham family. And they came from an under-resourced district, and they sued the state under the Common Benefits Clause of the state constitution. And essentially they were making the case that some students in the state were advantaged over other students because of where they live. And there's a lot of those kind of court cases still happening in other states across the country now. But in Vermont, this happened in the mid-90s. The state Supreme Court sided with the Brigham family and instructed the legislature to find a more equitable solution. And in that decision, I always like to kind of quote, it's actually, I don't spend a lot of time reading court decisions, but this is a good one because there's a lot of good stuff in this. And what they said was, to keep a democracy competitive and thriving, students must be afforded equal access to all that our education system has to offer. So it was really about making sure all kids had the same access to opportunity. And the other piece of it was that the state had a constitutional obligation to ensure substantial equity of educational opportunity throughout the state of Vermont. But a couple other things that the decision talked about, which maybe people aren't as familiar with, was that there was this acknowledgement that the goal was not perfect equity. The goal was not everybody spends the same amount, right? There was sort of, that you wanted to maintain some flexibility. And the decision really recognized the tension between local control and statewide equity, and emphasized the goal of both sort of pushing toward greater equity among towns, but also protecting local control. And so that's resulted in the system that we have now, which began with Act 60 of 1997, and then Act 68 of 2004 really sort of refined the system and led to where we are now. And the system that we have now is really based on three central principles: fairness for students, fairness for taxpayers, and protecting local control. So all resources in the system are shared. Taxpayers pay the same rate for the same per pupil spending, and we retained all of the elements of local control except the use of the local tax base for funding. So communities are still voting on school budgets. That determines their residential tax rates. They're still making all the decisions about how to manage their schools, like, personnel decisions, school policy, all that kind of thing. So I want to spend a little time on how sort of each of these principles show up in the system that we have now, and then, like I say, kind of get to the contours of the discussion of what the changes look like. So starting with fairness for students. The main way that Vermont ensures fairness to students is that school taxes are statewide taxes that go into one big pot. So that we all share this pot. So again, in Vermont, it means that school funding is not dependent on the wealth of the particular community. And it may not seem like a big deal whether the tax is assessed by the state or the locality, but Vermont is one of only 2 states where this is true, where it's a state level tax, all the revenue is pooled, and then it's distributed across the state. So this one big pot, the education fund, has 3 major revenue sources: residential or homestead taxes, which is a mix of property-based and income-based taxes; the non-homestead taxes, that blue slice, which is all other property. If it's not a primary home, it's commercial property, it's rental property, it's ski resorts, it's second homes, all that goes into that other slice, and that's a property-based tax. And then the third piece is consumption taxes. 100% of the sales tax goes into the ed fund, along with a chunk of the meals and rooms tax. There's a few other little things like lottery revenue and a few other things, but they're not a huge amount of what goes into it. But the reason that it's being a state tax is important. There's 2 reasons, really. So the first is that we're all sharing that non-residential slice. That blue slice, which is about 40% of the ed fund, didn't used to be shared, right? It used to be that if you had a ski resort in your town, you could charge them property taxes, and then you got to keep all that money for your schools. And that was a huge innovation and a huge step forward in terms of the equity after Act 60, because we all shared that slice, right? So again, second homeowners, factories, ski resorts, commercial property, rental property, all of that was being shared as opposed to being kept within town borders, and that makes a big difference in terms of and that really made a big difference in some of the disparity between the wealthier towns and the less wealthy towns. Again, big step forward in fairness for students, because they now all have access to the same pot of resources. And as you can imagine, before Brigham, there were big pots and small pots, right? Some towns, you'd have a bedroom community, not necessarily a lot of commercial property. They couldn't raise a lot with their tax rates. Whereas you'd have some towns that could raise a lot because, again, maybe they had a ski resort and lots of second homes or whatever that looked like. So, and we think about it kind of like the gas tax, right? So just because you buy your gas in Rutland doesn't mean that the tax goes to Rutland's roads only, right? We pool it, we have a statewide, please.
But it's very fuzzy.
Is it fuzzy? Is that, should I switch microphones? Is it helpful? Maybe it's my hair. I don't know.
Oh, because you've got a mic on.
Yeah, I've got a mic on. Is it better if I use,
What do you think? I mean,
you all tell me.
if it's just me, it just sort of, there's a cloud shape that I'm holding.
Is there, do you want me to try, does this mic work?
That one goes to the live stream, so.
Oh, this one.
Oh, there's the problem too, isn't it? I'm
So
sorry.
I need to keep this mic on. Okay,
Fair enough.
okay, well,
I'll try.
I don't know if it helps to turn it down a little bit. I don't know. Let's see. But so to go back, this sort of idea of the gas tax, right? We pool it, no matter where you pay your gas taxes, they're going into the statewide transportation fund. And there's a statewide plan to how we take care of the roads, right? It's not one road at a time. It's not just the roads in your town that get the benefit of that. But the second reason that it being a statewide tax is important is because we're really thinking about that residential slice collectively. So that, I don't know, teal slice, I guess, on top, the 25%, right? Towns are not, we're all collectively paying for all Vermont kids since Act 60 of 1997. No town is funding its own schools. Everyone's drawing on all slices in the pot. They're all mixed together, right? And you can see the non-residential slice and the consumption slice are about 3/4, 75% of the total pot. So that residential slice is really the 25%, right? And so we're thinking about that as what our contribution is to the residential slice. So rather than think about that the money in our town is just going to our own schools, it's really more accurate to think that it's our contribution to the residential slice of that pot. But residents of each town are still deciding how much to spend on their schools. And I think that doesn't necessarily make a lot of intuitive sense to people, right? You think you're contributing to your own schools. But the way that the system actually works is your tax rate is really, it is connected to your per pupil spending, but it's also about what we need from that whole residential slice collectively. But this is sort of where local control comes in, where this principle of local control comes in. So we do have local control over school budgets. Again, you probably all voted on town meeting day or whenever your town holds its vote. Local school boards, local voters are determining local spending each year. But this is one of the things that's up for debate in Montpelier right now, right? Where the legislature and the governor are talking about what's going to happen. Whether Vermont should go back to a one-size-fits-all foundation system where the state decides how much everybody spends, or whether we should keep the system we have now where local voters get to decide. So that's one question to keep in mind as we sort of talk about the discussion, you know, what the current debates are. But I think it's worth pointing out that school budgets are really different from all other spending in the state budget because voters are directly deciding how much to spend and therefore how much to tax themselves each year, right? So unlike the rest of the state budget, we first figure out how much we need, how much we want to spend, and then we set the tax rates to raise that amount. With the rest of the state budget, whatever we get in personal income tax revenue, whatever we get in, you know, the rest of the meals and rooms tax, that determines what the level of our state budget is. But with school budget, it pretty much works the opposite way, right? And it also means that while we're all paying for all of the kids, we're also trusting each community to know best what they need for their kids. And then we add up all of those budgets across the state to determine what we need to collectively raise in that pot. And the local spending decisions do have tax implications for the residents of that town and that district, right? They determine the residential tax rates that local homeowners pay in each town. This is where fairness for taxpayers comes in. The idea is that, and this wasn't true before 1997, the idea is that resident taxpayers in any town are going to pay the same rate for the same per pupil spending. The non-residential rate, the non-homestead rate on all those other kinds of property is one fixed rate statewide because those taxpayers aren't voting on the school budget, right? They're not the ones deciding, so their rate doesn't vary with that choice. Instead, we have one rate for all that other kinds of property across the state, and that is the same everywhere. But because taxpayers are voting on the school budget, because residents are deciding, there's tax implications to their decisions. The rates for those residential school taxes are determined each year by per pupil spending in your town based on that budget you approved on town meeting day or whatever your process is. Towns with more spending per pupil have higher tax rates. Those with lower spending per pupil have lower rates, and towns with the same rates, with same per pupil spending have the same rates. It sounds pretty straightforward, but it wasn't true before 1997, right? So before 1997, this is how it looked. You could have, if you go out to the right, you could have a really high tax rate and still not a lot to spend per pupil. The y-axis is spending per pupil. The x-axis is your tax rate. But you could have a 50-cent tax rate in some towns and be able to spend tons of money per pupil because you had a lot of property wealth in your town. So there was no coherent relationship between what you had to spend per pupil and what your tax rate was, right? So it just depended on how much property wealth you had in your town. But since Act 60, there's a coherent relationship between tax rates and what you have to spend per pupil. Towns that make the same effort, that is, have the same tax rate, get the same amount to spend per pupil. So everybody with a $1.20 tax rate has the same amount to spend per pupil, whether that's $15,000, whatever it is this year. But it's the same amount. That's the idea. Resident taxpayers make the same effort for the same per pupil spending. And that was one of the major advances of Act 60. So your budget decision, so you get the same payments from the education fund per pupil, regardless of how much the residents of that town are contributing, right? Your budget decision does have tax implication. It determines your tax rate, but you're not expected to raise a greater share of your budget if you spend more. So in one town, the rate might raise a quarter of the budget, again, not thinking that what you raise in your town is just going to your schools, but the rate might raise a quarter of the budget, another town it might raise a third of the budget. The share of the budget isn't important because we're calibrating the tax rates based on how much we need that whole residential slice to be and not on what your particular budget is. So this is making things much fairer for taxpayers, right? Unlike before Act 60, when you could tax yourselves a really high rate and not have much money back, now same rate, same money back from the ed fund. The other part of fairness to taxpayers is that we try to have a system, much more so than any other state, based on ability to pay. And the best measure of your ability to pay is your income, because you're paying taxes out of your income. That didn't used to be true when we started the public education system, right? Back hundreds of years ago, when we started public education systems, property was the best measure of your ability to pay because many people didn't have jobs outside the home, and they might actually go sell a cow to pay their property taxes, right? It was based on your cows, your sheep, your land, all that kind of stuff. And that might be how you paid your school taxes. That's no longer true, right? Most people have income from jobs and they pay their school taxes. They pay all their taxes out of their income. You don't sell part of your house to pay your school taxes. So it's the best measure of ability to pay. So we've taken a lot of steps in Vermont to make school taxes more based on income than in any other state. And the way that it works, so this is what income sensitivity is, if you're familiar with that term. You basically get the choice. You get to pay whatever's cheaper, either based on your income or based on your property value. And for most Vermonters, paying by income is the better deal. But for those at the high end of the income scale, it's cheaper for them to pay based on property value. And part of that is because you don't necessarily keep buying a bigger and bigger house the more income you have, right? Like you might just need a 4-bedroom house regardless of how much income you have. So there's some relationship, but it doesn't both grow at the same rate. So for a lot of higher income taxpayers, paying based on property is a much better value. But regardless of how you pay, whether you're paying based on income or you're paying based on property, the more you spend per pupil, the higher your rate. So every town has 2 rates, an income rate and a property rate, and they're both going up and down with per pupil spending. So this is the idea behind income sensitivity, right? That you can pay based on income or you can pay based on property value. There are some guidelines. It's a little more complicated than that, right? There's some quirks in the system. So the reality is that income sensitivity has gotten out of whack. This is what we're saying. How it's gotten out of whack is that it's really no longer doing what it was originally intended to do, and low and middle income Vermonters are really paying the price on their school tax bills. So they can face big jumps in their tax bills because of certain quirks in the system. We've been referring to this as the 3 cliffs problem. So built into the system are these thresholds on income and home values that require some low and moderate income people to pay both an income tax and a tax on part of their property value. And these thresholds create what we call these tax cliffs, where an extra dollar of income or a property reappraisal in your town can really cause your tax bill to jump and have disproportionate tax consequences. And these thresholds have not been raised or adjusted for inflation in decades. So if you can see this, I don't know if this is clear for everybody, but on the left are the household income thresholds. So that $47,000 threshold hasn't been changed since 1985, at least. So it was in place long before Act 60 came around. It hasn't changed. The $90,000 threshold hasn't changed in 17 years, since 2008, right? So you can imagine as people's incomes go up and their property values go up, more and more of them are crossing these cliffs and crossing these thresholds and falling into this place where they're paying both an income and a property value share. And the property value thresholds on the right there, you're right, I guess, the 400,000 and the 225,000, those were actually lowered by the state in 2018 in order to get more taxes out of moderate income people. right? So they used to be 500,000 and 250, and they were lowered. And again, as you might imagine, especially with the property value growth that we've been seeing in the last few years, there are not that many houses under that 225 mark anymore in Vermont, and certainly there's a whole lot more houses above that 400,000 mark. So the share of people who are who are crossing these thresholds and facing these cliffs has grown a lot and continues to grow. So just to give you an illustration, a homeowner who crosses that $47,000 threshold can see a school tax increase of 10, 15, 25% or more, and that's not even count whether or not their school budget goes up, right? Whether or not education spending goes up, that's happening. And another example, so somebody with a house around the state median, which is about 350,000 these days, if they cross that $90,000 threshold, so they get $1 more in income, their tax bill can go up by 70% or more, right? Because all of a sudden now they're paying a property piece on everything over 225. So all of a sudden they have a tax bill on $125,000 in property value that they didn't have before. So this is what we mean when we say income sensitivity has gotten out of whack. The thresholds haven't changed, and that's putting more and more pressure on low and moderate income Vermonters and really shifting more of the taxes, the school tax total, onto the people who qualify for income sensitivity. So we need to fix these cliffs so taxpayers don't see these kind of jumps. That's one area where there's plenty of room for improvement. And it's really about the property tax side of the system, because it's really about your property value getting away from your ability to pay that's complicating Vermonters' tax bills and making them bigger. But there's another problem that I think hasn't been talked about quite as much, which is that when it comes to school funding, certain costs hit certain districts differently, right? Not all districts have the same costs, and they don't all have the same options for how to cover those costs. So we always talk about the 4 factors that affect your town tax rate, only one of which is really under the control of the local school board and the voters. So the 4 factors are changes in education spending, that's the one that's under your control that you're deciding on town meeting day. Changes in student enrollment, don't really have control over that. Changes in property value, don't really have control over that. And then the yield set each year by the legislature, which is what determines how much your tax rates generate for each student. So we've always known that certain costs hit certain districts differently, and we make these adjustments at the state level to smooth those differences. And there's 2 ways that we do that. We do that through categorical aid, and we do it through pupil weighting adjustments. So, and we have categorical aid. Right now we have categorical aid for, this is probably too small for you to see, but there's categorical aid for transportation and special education services. And then we have pupil weights for kids in poverty, for multilingual learners, based on grade level now. And then we've also just recently added weights for small schools and sparsity. And what we mean by sparsity is if you're a school and there's nothing else around for miles, you probably need more resources, right? Because you don't have the option of field trips, or you don't have the option of sort of leaning on the community around you for things. But this is how the tools currently work. So on the left side, categorical aid, that sort of orange hat, right? It's not factored into what's considered your education spending. So your total school budget is the big yellow circle, then the categorical aid is the orange hat. So it's sort of taken off the top. It doesn't affect your tax rate. In other words, that's sort of paid for collectively. It's not affecting your individual town budget or your individual tax rate. There's a couple other small things in there, but the biggest pieces are these categorical aid for transportation. Again, recognizing that not all districts have transportation costs. Some of the rural districts have much more in transportation costs than others. And then special education services. Again, special education services, the state picks up some share of the cost, and there is a difference from district to district what share of the population needs those services. There's been some reforms to those over recent years, but this is the gist of it. And then on the right side of the equation, so this is how we actually calculate your per pupil spending. So your education spending in your district is actually a subset of your school budget, so the yellow thing without the orange hat on. And then it's divided by the number of pupils. But it's not just the number of pupils like the butts and seats. It's the number of pupils weighted, and it's weighted for all of these things: the multilingual learners, the kids from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, as well as the small schools piece, the sparsity piece, and then there's a grade level weight too. There's also been very recent changes to the pupil weights a lot of places. In fact, changes to pupil weights, the first year they went into full effect was FY25, which played a big role in why the FY25 budgets were so out of whack with all the other years, because there were all these changes being factored in, and because there were some temporary adjustments made for those changes to be implemented. But what you can see from this system is that you can see how changes in enrollment affect your number. So whatever that weighted pupils is, so the more kids you have in those categories, the bigger the denominator is, the more weighted pupils you have. Kids come into the district, kids leave the district, that denominator is going up or down, so your per pupil spending goes up or down accordingly, right? And your per pupil spending is what determines your rate. So even though, you know, the total education spending might not change, if you have either changes to the weights or changes in enrollment, that denominator is going to change. And then there's changes in property values, which many people have experienced in the last few years, that cause an increase in the tax rate. And the way that that works is that if property values in the entire state rose at the same rate, it wouldn't have an effect, but they don't. They increase at different rates in different towns. So it doesn't appreciate at the same rate everywhere. So all else being equal, the way the state thinks about it is that if you're in a town where the property values increase more than the statewide average, the state says, well, you owe more to that slice because you now have a bigger share of the total statewide property tax base. So if you're in a town where they grow faster, you might see a tax rate just because of that, a tax rate increase just because of that. Again, the assumption being that your town can afford to contribute more because they're now a bigger part of the tax base. And then the last of the four factors is the yield. So every year the legislature determines the yield, which is how much a $1 property tax rate and a 2% income rate generates per pupil. It moves a little bit, and sometimes the way that the pupils are calculated moves a little bit, so there's some moving parts, but there's lots of other moving parts into that too. So when they're calculating that yield, they're not just looking at what do you get from the income tax base and the property tax base, but there's also counting all the other moving parts in the pot. So for example, the other revenue coming into the pot might change, right? The sales tax, generally it grows, but we certainly saw it take a hit in the first year of the pandemic, right? Sales tax plummeted. And so we often think of that residential and non-residential slice, people refer to them as shock absorbers, because the idea is that they essentially grow to fit whatever the rest of the pot needs to be. So we take all the sales tax revenue, we take the meals and rooms revenue, we figure out what that red slice is, we figure out the total we need, and then we make sure that the residential and non-residential slices are enough to fill the rest of the need. And the basic idea, we don't have to get too much into the weeds, or maybe I'm already there, but both of those two things are supposed to move together, right? The non-residential rate and the residential rate move together. The idea is we can't just make all the non-residential people or buildings or companies pick up any increase that we need. They're supposed to move proportionally together. So they both expand to increase to fill whatever we need to raise. So a whole lot of this is out of the control of the local voters. There's so many other things happening, and I think that's part of why a lot of people feel frustrated with the system, because what decisions they make in their town don't necessarily lead to control over their tax bills, right? And so I think that's a lot of the problem. But we would say that local control is still critical because communities know best how to spend the money and what the priorities are in their community. And that the job of the state and the purpose of the one big pot is to ensure that we're raising all of the money we need as fairly as possible, and to make sure that we sort of have that statewide lens on those cost differences across districts so that we can smooth those cost differences across district. But the goal is not that there's no flexibility in what communities spend and that we all spend the same. One of the challenges with the cost piece of things is that the costs that are different across districts really change from year to year. You know, it's transportation costs can change, but also there's new things. Which brings us to what we think of as the perfect storm of what it went into FY25. The Agency of Education was pretty clear about the main cost drivers in FY25, and these pretty much applied across the state. One, big increases in the cost of healthcare for teachers. Two, other cost increases driven by high inflation. So whether it's, I don't know if schools still buy pencils, but whatever the other costs are, right? Like the food, all of these things, there were inflation-driven increases in all that. The loss of the COVID era federal ESSER funds. So during the worst of the pandemic, there were also big pots of money for public education, and those pretty much went away by FY25. They applied in like 22, 23, and 24. And the other thing was increasing demand for mental health care services for kids. So this just reflects the number of staff, mental health care specific staff in our public education system. And this is the difference between, over 3 years, between 2022 and 2025, an almost 5-fold increase in the number of mental health care positions that schools needed. But the result of all these demands, and I'll add, there also were these mistakes in the implementation of the pupil weights in FY25 that created a lot of confusion and chaos for school boards. I don't know if you remember all that, but there were last-minute changes just before town meeting day to how the tax rates were going to change after school budgets had already been developed. So that added a lot of complication too. The result was that in FY25, almost all districts had increases in spending. Many districts had substantial tax increases, and a third of budgets were rejected the first go around, compared to just a handful in a normal year. Eventually, all those got passed, even in Barrie, where it took them until September to get a budget that they could say yes to. But districts had to cut back a fair amount to get those budgets passed. So, you know, the first round was higher, and then they kept coming back lower and lower until they could get a budget to pass. And then those spending and tax increases really became the focus of last year's state elections. And reforming education became the top priority for this legislative session. But I would say that there remains a lot of disagreement about both the definition of the problem, right? What is the problem? What factors played into the jumps? Is spending too high overall? Or was there something weird that happened in FY25 that we need to fix? What's going on? And there's just as much disagreement about what the solutions are, right? What we should do about those problems. So for many people, including policymakers, two things can be true at the same time. Not all kids are getting the resources they need, and many Vermonters think that school taxes are too high. So, and that pattern didn't hold for the budgets we just passed, right? The FY26 budgets kind of went back to baseline. 90% of them passed on the first try again. Some of that was due to districts, again, making kind of preemptive cuts in their budgets to get them to pass. But FY25 was unusual. Over the past 20 years, adjusted for inflation, education spending has pretty much been flat. So that bottom, I don't know if you can read this, that bottom line, the blue line, that's education spending. The yellow line in the middle is the entire state budget of just state funds. And then the red line at the top is the total state budget, including federal funds. So what you see there is they're all pretty steady, adjusted for inflation, meaning they're mostly keeping up with inflation. The big difference in the red line is all the federal influx of money during the COVID period, right? The COVID relief funds. So that's adjusted for inflation. But what that means is when inflation is high, which it has been the last few years, we're keeping up with inflation, but that's more of a stretch than it was in years prior. But what that means is we're basically spending the same share of the state resources on public education as we have for decades. It hasn't changed. But FY25 was a bit of an anomaly in the sense that we did see these bigger jumps in spending and these bigger jumps in tax bills as a result. So, please.
Just a clarification.
Sure.
The same percentage of state resources on education.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, part of it is the more education you spend, then that increases the amount of money the state is taking in. So that.
Sure. It's a little bit of a circular thing. Sure.
If you could just restate that, I apologize.
No. I think that's a fair question. So the point is, public education is pretty much always a third of the state budget. Even when the state budget might be growing faster, it stays about a third of the state budget. But it's been pretty consistent, adjusted for inflation. We're spending about the same share of the state's economy on it. And even when you adjust for declining enrollment, where education funding is growing about 1% a year. Per pupil spending is growing about 1% a year after adjusting for inflation. So you do see this. So it's essentially the same share. When we think about the state budget, education is the same share of the state budget as it has been for decades.
But then the reduction in pupils then would be significant to that, because you're paying the same person state budget for a smaller population.
Right, but the same share of the state budget, we're spending essentially the same share of resources on public education as we have all along. And we're seeing that a decline, we're seeing the student-teacher ratio stay about the same and the per pupil spending stay about the same. So, I think part of the reason for that is I think some of the decline in enrollment, it's been a gradual process. So it happened before these 20 years. It was happening already before these 20 years. So I think there's a lot of factors in there. But I think it's a question, right? Do we think that's the right share of our resources? How big a priority is public education? Should it shrink as the population shrinks? What does it look like? It is shrinking some as the population shrinks. But is it shrinking, what is the right commitment level? I think that's a question. Again, it's one of the biggest things the state does. And we've spent a pretty consistent share of resources on it for decades. So is it that it's suddenly too expensive for us? Or is it that that's about the right amount? I don't know. These are some of the questions that I think people should consider. But before we and I want to keep an eye on time here, before we get to where the kind of current debates are in Montpelier and around the state, I think these conversations are happening. I kind of want to sum up what I think of the key takeaways about the good and the bad in our current funding system, right? So the good, I would say it's a good thing that we strike this balance between state and local control. We're pooling the resources, but we're also giving communities plenty of say in their schools. All kids have access to the same pots, but communities still have a lot of say in the schools. The second is that we do have less disparity from town to town than other states do, and than we had before 1997 in the foundation system. And any disparity that remains is less driven by town wealth. The third good thing is that taxpayers in all towns are paying the same rates for the same per pupil spending. Again, major step forward with Act 60 and 68. Another good thing is that for most taxpayers, school taxes are based on income, the best measure of their ability to pay. So again, unlike what was happening before 1997 and before we started adjusting school taxes for income, your property tax bill could lose you your property if you couldn't afford it. And that's just less true now because we have because school taxes are adjusted for income much more in Vermont than they are in most other states. And then the last thing I'd highlight as a good thing about the system is that we do have this statewide lens that allows us to smooth some of the cost differences across districts. On the sort of negative side of the ledger, I would say the fact that low and middle income Vermonters pay a bigger share of their income and school taxes than the highest income taxpayers is a negative. This issue of the cliffs and income sensitivity being out of whack is something that's very fixable, but is present and is getting worse the longer we let those sort of fixed thresholds ride. The third is this problem of certain costs are going to hit some districts harder than others, and spending cuts won't solve that problem, right? They'll still be unevenly distributed, everything will just be lower. And again, that's not necessarily something to solve, but it's not something that we can solve necessarily, but it's something that we can adjust for when we measure those things. The fourth thing is that many of the cost drivers that cause the stress in FY25 continue to affect schools, and they're out of district's control. They're not school funding problems. The cost of teacher health care is not a school funding problem, right? It's a cost of health care problem because we know Vermont has the highest cost of health care in the country, not just for teachers, but for all of us. The demand for mental health care services is not a school funding problem. And spending cuts or a one-size-fits-all approach, that's not going to make healthcare cheaper. It's not going to bring down inflation. So those are going to continue to be a problem unless we do something about the root of those problems. And then this last thing, which I think causes a lot of frustration, and is a lot of what I get from community conversations about this, which is the frustration that your tax bill feels disconnected from your choice on town meeting day. It feels disconnected from the school spending, and that's because of the property value problem. Again, If your property value is growing faster than the people around you or faster than the towns around you, you're going to owe more, and that can feel very disconnected and is very disconnected, right? So we do have this unique funding system. We've accomplished a lot in terms of equity, narrowed the disparity, really brought up the bottom of the spending curve. That's part of why there's less disparity, is because we've brought up the bottom. And just to show that, most students now fall in a much narrower spending range than they did before Act 60. And most low spenders aren't low spenders consistently. Most low spenders kind of fall for a year because of weird things, and they sort of pop back closer to the mean. Same with high spenders. Most high spenders aren't up there every year after year. There are a few, but for the most part, you kind of pop up because you lost some students or because some other thing happened in that year, and then you kind of return to the mean. So it's not that there's a consistent group at either the high or low end. So those are big steps forward from where we were and where many states still are. But clearly there's still a lot of inequity across districts. Some have had to make a lot of cuts, others have been able to grow. Some of that might be cultural, community-based. Some of that, I think, is a reflection of the economic insecurity a lot of Vermonters are experiencing, and the fact that school taxes are hitting low and middle income Vermonters harder than higher income Vermonters. So I want to take maybe 5 minutes and give you a quick overview of the governor and House plans if you haven't been reading about them and following them. And then, like I say, kind of open it up to just throw out some questions for discussion or open it up to questions. So the governor and the House, so you probably heard the House just passed their education funding plan last week. Senate's working on theirs. Where it all lands, your guess is as good as mine. But here's what the governor and House have in common. So they're aligned on a lot of the big things. And then I'll talk a little bit about where they're different. So they both want to move to back to this foundation approach, where there's sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, and the state sets a fixed spending amount for everyone. You would still have pupil weights, so there'd still be adjustments for these pupils in these categories, and then that amount would be adjusted for inflation going forward. There would be, in both their plans, there would be state-imposed consolidation to fewer districts, which means in both their plans they would be reducing or eliminating the role of local school boards. The foundation approach would be paid for with a statewide property-based tax. So both plans lean into a property base and kind of get away from the income sensitivity and the income-based system. They still have they both have what they're calling a homestead exemption approach, which means rather than your taxes being paid on the income rate through income sensitivity, that they would just exempt a portion of your home value from school taxes. And the lower your income, the more of your value would be exempt. But the main driver of your tax bill would now be your property value more than your income, the way it is now. Where they're different, where there's some daylight between the House and the governor, the House has a little bit of a longer timeline, although that got scrunched a bit in the last version. The House has a higher foundation starting amount than the governor, so that's significant. They're starting from a higher place, and then they both adjust for inflation over time. The governor is expanding the use of vouchers. The House is limiting and constraining the use of vouchers. The governor's homestead exemption plan is a fixed dollar amount, whereas the House is a percentage of value. The governor's consolidation plan is 5 districts. The House hasn't committed to a number, but they're asking a subcommittee to look into it and to propose 3 different plans that would get you to districts of 4,000 kids, which means about 20 to 21 districts from where we are now. And depending on who you ask now, we have about 100 districts or we have 50 districts. We have about 100 districts, but we have 50 supervisory unions. So it sort of depends on where you're looking from, but either way, going to 5 or going to 20 is a whole lot of consolidation. And then the last point is that the governor is pretty explicit that one of his main goals is to reduce our total spending on public education, that there will be cuts, that there will be hundreds of millions of dollars in savings. I think the House may also share that goal, but they're also trying to make sure that they bring up the bottom, right? That they reduce some of the inequities at the bottom. So I think that's a big part of what they're trying to do. So that's mostly what I had to talk about. I'll just kind of bring up a couple of questions, and then you all feel free to ask me questions or to comment on your concerns, thoughts, whatever. So again, thinking back to the relationship between public education and democracy, thinking about whether or not it's important to have that democratic participation on town meeting day in terms of voting on school budgets or not, I think that's a question that we should all get to decide on. And so what that means is, do we want to take control of the spending decisions away from local voters and leave it to the agency of education? I think this other question I asked you to think about, which is what would it look like if Vermont kids had the resources they need to succeed? But I think maybe the more specific question there is which of those resources should come through the public schools. Again, I think we've talked a lot about the mental health. Schools are a great resource for kids. They're going to get services delivered there because that's where they are. It makes sense that schools offer that. But does that come out of the school funding pot, or does it come out of a different pot? Where is the mental health care system? We need a more robust mental health care system. What does that look like? But I think there's also a question about if we have to put pupil weights on for kids coming from an economically disadvantaged background, does it make more sense to expand the child tax credit for when they're younger and then they're not in poverty when they come into the school system? I think there's a lot of questions about sort of schools are the backstop for a lot of societal problems. And so as long as there's societal problems, schools are going to have to be that backstop. And so, what of these things should we be thinking about outside of the school system versus what are these things, should be available through the school system, but only sort of as needed. The other thing I would say is, I guess I'd ask this question to people because I've gotten a lot of different answers on this question, which is, I think the governor and the legislature both heard last year's elections as a call for major reform. Was it a call for major reform, or was it just a call for property tax relief? I think that's a question. I think in some people's minds it's one or the other. So that's a question. One of our concerns is that there's been a whole lot of education policy reforms over the last decade, and I'm not sure all of them have lived up to their promises. And I would say that they all had probably some negative unintended consequences along the way too. And then the last thing I'd ask you to think about, or feel free to comment on, is what's changed since November, right? We saw a lot of, FY26 was sort of a back to baseline year on town meeting day. Most budgets passed. There weren't big spikes. This didn't happen again. Was FY25 an anomaly? We're also looking at a lot of uncertainty at the federal level about education and education funding. So does that factor into what we want to do at the state level right now? Those are my questions, and that's I'm happy to answer any questions about the presentation, or I just love to hear from thoughts up from any of you. I'm sure you're sick of my talking at this point. Well, how about my voice is tired? I'm definitely ready for a break. How's that? There you go. I got to remember the water bottle. Thank you. Thank you. It's the mic. Yeah.
It got better. It got better, I think, with our modern technology. We have all these wonderful ways to do things, and there's something called feedback that I think was quite
Interferes a bit. Go. Oh yeah. Should we turn, so people on thank you. So people can hear online too.
Is this working?
I think it's,
Okay.
there we go.
In the idea of consolidating school districts, has anybody mentioned the idea of making the districts countywide?
I think everything has been thrown out onto the table. So people have talked about the technical center regions, people have talked about the supervisory union levels, there's been all kinds of things thrown out.
And talking about the house value, I know my house hasn't been reassessed in years. It's going to happen. I don't think there is a statewide reassessment timeline so that everybody's reassessment comes at the same time.
It went off again. I don't know. Yeah.
Because I know that with what's been happening since COVID, the values have gone up tremendously, but then the tax rate would go down.
And, right, and this is part of what's screwy, I think. So there actually is a plan in the House to create a statewide appraisal system, and so that everybody is on a standard schedule, so that it is an organized system by the state where there's a cycle. So it's no more than 7 years between reappraisals, and it's all done by the same system, so there's a little bit more standardization of that process. I think there's still challenges with using property values as the base, because people do pay their taxes out of their income. And, you know, in some areas, as you said, they're growing much faster than people's incomes, right? Property values are growing much faster than people's incomes in a lot of places, and certainly they have over the years. So I think, and there's a little bit something that's screwy that, again, might be more technical than you need to know, but what happens in the years between your appraisal is that there's adjustments applied at the town-wide level. So they are moving your assessed value up in the state's mind. They are moving those values up, but they're not doing it on an individual property basis. They're doing it at a town basis. So depending on where you are in the town, depending on how big your town is, there can be some real disparity from neighborhood to neighborhood. And so it can be a real shock when there's a reappraisal, right? And again, and some of this is also, like, let's not lose sight of the fact that your municipal taxes are property taxes, so that also plays into this in the sense that you're still going to have some property-based taxes, but I think Jacob's got the mic for you.
At a certain point, you mentioned something you call what's needed
Mm-hmm.
for the system.
Mm-hmm.
But the conversation has all been about how do you get the money for what's needed. Are there any conversations that are going on that are talking about what's needed?
In terms of what kids need?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Well, I don't know. I wanna know. You said it. I wanna know.
Okay, what do I mean? That's fair. So I think there's a lot of good questions. I mean, we tend to focus on the finance piece because that's what we've been focused on for a long time. But we work with a lot of partners who work on more of the educational outcome side of things. And I think there's a lot of good questions and thoughtful conversations happening. But we have these educational quality standards at the state level, right? And so that's part of the question I think we should be asking, which is who gets to decide what are the critical building blocks that every kid should have public education wise? Does everybody get art? Does everybody get a library? Does everybody get language? What does that look like? There's some guidance at the state level, but that's mostly not prescribed. We have graduation standards and graduation requirements, and then we have these education quality standards. But there's not always a lot of, it's more guidance than it is prescription, right? So I think there's a question about, you know, we want towns to have some flexibility and we want communities to have some flexibility, and we want it to be fair for kids. So I think those are parts of the question, and I think there are conversations happening about the education quality standards. I think you're right in saying that unfortunately the tax conversation tends to drive more of the conversation in Montpelier than the educational outcomes piece. In the weighting conversation, a lot of that was about outcomes, right? There was a lot of analysis about what would it take for kids in the weighted category to come up to the average outcomes in math and reading. Again, that was a pretty narrow focus, and I think there was concern about the narrowness of that focus, that math and reading scores aren't the only and best measure of how kids are doing. But at the same time, that was sort of the focus of sort of the education consultants and where they should be. So yes, I wish that was a more active part of the conversation. We're not the ones to lead it, but I certainly agree that the education quality standards are the mechanism we have, but I don't know how much engagement there is with those across the state, across Vermonters, across educators, all of the above.
Both Franklin Northeast Supervisory Union and Maple Run in St. Albans and Fairfield have gone through processes where they now have 3 or 4 statements about outcomes and what kids should be able to do when they leave school. Mm-hmm. And that's starting to develop, but to me that's essential to this conversation.
agreed.
And we're not having that. In fact, I would think there's potential for significant savings in education expenditure, given what technology has now provided. I can remember 30 years ago, and my timing's well off, but in Franklin County in those days, if you wanted to take an AP course, you did it over what our local TV system works on. I don't know the language, but so kids in a small high school like Craftsbury, which isn't in Franklin County, but one's that size, or isn't in Franklin County, ones that size, the 3 kids who wanted to take AP math could sign up with kids from other schools, and you didn't have to do it. I was dumb enough, not formally, but privately, to suggest back in the 80s when Enosburg had a lot of empty houses, and we had to put an addition on the school, that we buy the houses, bring them up to code, and we could sell them off one-on-one if we get less kids.
I mean, creativity, I like
Well,
it. Creativity, why not?
Well,
But,
my observation of bureaucratic systems is that they get further and further entrenched, and my inability to follow is, the whole thing tonight is that we've done that.
yeah.
I can't even follow you, but that's partly age.
No, I think it's a fair
So,
system,
and-
question.
And those that kind of conversation is not going on in the state anywhere that
Yeah.
I can find.
Yeah. Yeah.
A former colleague of mine has written a book, the subtitle of which is Schooling Ain't Learning. All right? And he posits a whole different management structure for education systems. Do you have it?
No, but I think everybody should read this one, because it's
Yes.
about that too.
The point I'm making is that we're not having a rich enough
Yeah.
discussion to be
Yeah.
able to figure out how much
Yeah.
money to spend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We definitely,
And it's a mess.
I agree with
Why
that.
is that happening?
I think sometimes we public assets are contributing to that problem by talking too much about the taxes and not enough about what we're trying to do with the public education system. I mean, to that point, I find that quote from Brigham very inspiring, which is that to have a competitive, thriving democracy, you need a strong public education system, because you want kids who are engaged and well-informed and well-educated to grow up and be part of, that community and that democracy. And so I think you're largely, I don't disagree with you. And I think that it's easy to get lost in the weeds of the financing system and stay in that kind of lane and not have some of these bigger conversations. I do think this, if you haven't read the book of the year yet, it's really great, and it's really about a kid who, is trying to figure out what public education isn't working for him. So, what do we do there? And I think that's true of a lot of kids. I also think, it's worth just noting, I mean, I don't know about you all, like my kids are not recovered from the pandemic. Their peers are not recovered from the pandemic. The schools are still struggling with and some of that mental health care needs. There's still a lot we're emerging from, and I think the kids' developmental challenges and academic challenges and all those things, we're not recovered. So I think we're still also kind of in the thick of those challenges too. So I don't want to lose sight of that either. But I don't disagree with anything you're saying.
I think our last question.
Fair enough.
So I guess I have multiple questions, but I'll stick to 2.
Yeah.
One is your question about the school system and, the taxes, if it's broken. A lot of us knew this beforehand, but Governor Scott finally said it publicly and loudly, which is we were paying taxes at the second highest in the nation, and our performance was about average. And worse than that, Vermont is not a particularly challenging state. I've lived elsewhere, okay? I mean, rural poverty is unfortunate, but other than that, we shouldn't even have to, we should be better than our spending, not worse. So I think it's pretty clear cut that whatever came together, we have a system that needed reform. I won't go into the complexities that lead to perverse incentives associated with all the ways funding is jiggled and played with. But I do think the other piece is accountability. I mean, a lot of Vermont standards are very subjective. And certainly if you had a small community with a small school, the people knew the teachers, they knew the students, they knew the outcomes. There's feedback. We don't have that sense. I mean, we can know, I've had 4 kids go through the school system, that probably is not a very good teacher, but that's about as far as it goes. So there are no, as far as I know, I've seen very few objective metrics. You know, if you add a new staffer, is there something that was wrong before that's better now? Or are they just busy? So again, I think the metrics that are applied are inadequate and too subjective that exist, and it's pretty clear cut that something was seriously broken, that we spent that much and performed at that level.
So I think I'd push back in a couple ways. I don't disagree with some of what you're saying, but I think I'd push back in a couple ways. One, I think we do generally have pretty good graduation rates and we have pretty good schools. And I think a lot of what people are pointing to is sort of the recent test scores as evidence that things are going in the wrong direction and that therefore, you know, there's problems in the schools. And I would argue that, you know, with the math test scores, again, whether you're looking at reading or math, yes, there's definitely been some falling off, and how much of that is driven by the pandemic versus other things. I'd also say a couple things, like some of the sort of per pupil spending is really kind of like a way of comparing apples to apples, but it's not totally apples to apples, right? When you look at state by state spending. So there are some real regional differences in how much states spend on schools. So the New England tends to be the highest region. We have the highest per pupil spending, you know, as a group, than the Southeast, than the Midwest. You know, we do tend to, as a group, sort of lean into that, into public schools. And so I think it's just sort of worth noting that that's always been true. Like, we've always sort of been at the top of that list, and are things actually getting worse and we're still at the top of that list, or are we just at the top of that list because, one, we've lifted up the bottom, right? A lot of the states that have lower per pupil spending, it's because there's more inequity in their system. They underfund a lot of the poorer schools, and so where they land on the per pupil spending tends to be lower because there's more inequity.
Sorry, clarification.
Mm-hmm.
If they underfund, then the students would underperform, and the metrics would indicate that.
And that's somewhat true. And that's somewhat true.
But we're still in the middle. And the other thing
Right.
is, was Vermont ever that much better in the middle? I mean, is it purely COVID?
Yeah, but we have very good graduation rates. We have some of the higher graduation rates. So I think it all depends on sort of what you're looking at. And I think there's definitely, I'm not disputing the fact that we spend more on schools than a lot of other states. I think that's pretty clear cut. But I think we've done that by choice for a lot of reasons for a long time. I do think the rurality comes into play. I also think that when we're sort of talking about the big picture of what should we do differently, how should this look, I think there's plenty of room for consolidation. I think you also sort of made a good point, which is like, there's a difference between putting elementary school kids on a bus for 2 hours and having bigger regional high schools. So there's also there's more nuance in this conversation than I think we can get to right now, but I would hope that we could have sort of as a state and as a community more of a nuanced conversation about what do kids need, what should they have, what's the best way to get it to them, and I think that's part of, you know, to give the House some credit, I do think part of they're trying to be more thoughtful about what consolidation might look like. Like, it's not just let's go all in on consolidation right away, but let's really talk about what that means. Like, who can we put together? What does that mean for the kids? What does that mean for the community? We have done consolidation a couple different ways over time in the state, and Act 46, I don't know how many people paid attention to Act 46, but there were a lot of problems with the implementation of Act 46. Some worked, some didn't work. Some people are pretty mad and wanted to get out of those mergers. Some people stayed in those mergers. But I think but then there's also been places where we've consolidated more gradually and given the community more time to kind of plan where the kids are going to go, have a couple years of phase-in, plan what they're going to do with the empty building in the middle of town, like have a more thoughtful approach. So I think there are, like, I don't think anybody's saying that there's not room for improvement or room, room to make adjustments. But I also think that there's a lot of demands on schools that weren't there before that is showing up in the spending. Some of this backstop on social services, some of this backstop on safety net, you know, not to mention increasing technology needs and security needs. You know, there's a lot of things that go into that conversation. I don't know. We're ready to wrap
Yeah,
up.
as someone who moved to Vermont just not quite 3 years ago, and I would just like to say that I think the amount and quality of discussion in the community here about education, it has really impressed me. It's really struck me, and I think the questions you're talking about are things that communities should have input on, should be there should be a mechanism, a way for local communities and residents to have input into how some of those questions are decided. And it sounds a bit like the way things are moving, all of those decisions will be made at a state level without local input, and that concerns me.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the question here. And I will say, the legislature at the end of last year put in place this Commission on the Future of Public Education. And then they were supposed to finish the recommendations by the end of 2025, and instead they're sort of like being sidelined as they're just sort of moving forward with these reforms without waiting for them to complete their work. Now, I don't know how thorough of a job they were prepared to do, but they were definitely looking at more community engagement, more hearing from communities, more, going out to different places and talking to people, and that sort of gotten sidelined. It does feel like this is happening pretty quickly. So, I think that's part of the conversation, and I definitely think that that's something that policymakers should hear, that communities should have more of a say in what is the process for that and what does that look like.
Well, thank you, Steph, for so much for leading us through this complex topic, and to the Brownell Library for hosting and Media Factory for the live stream. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you at the next Snapshot event next week.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.